There's nothing left to celebrate.
Sir? Someone call for help now.
Don't touch him.
The wine hit his tongue before the pain hit his spine. Kang Jun-hyuk set the glass down and reached for his wife's hand across the table, and that was the last steady thing his fingers ever touched that night. 8 years of marriage, and Yoon Hee-rin hadn't worn her ring once tonight. He'd asked her why over the appetizers. She'd told him she didn't think there was anything left to celebrate. He'd let it go, because a man who ran half of Seoul's underworld had learned to let small wounds close on their own. Then his hand started shaking. The glass slipped and shattered against the marble, and the sound cut through the private dining room like a gunshot. Men who had killed for him were on their feet before he hit the floor. His jaw locked, his vision tunneled. Somewhere above him, fabric rustled. His wife, rising from her chair, unhurried, almost graceful. She looked down at her husband convulsing at her feet and said 4 words. "Don't touch him." Nobody moved, nobody called for help. The most powerful woman in the room watched the most powerful man in Seoul choke on his own breath, and she didn't blink. It was a stranger who broke the silence. A waitress, 30 feet away, who took one look at his face and knew exactly what was killing him. Welcome back to, if you're new here, hit subscribe, because you do not want to miss where this one goes. Drop a comment, and let me know where in the world you're watching from tonight. Now settle in, because this story is about to get a lot more dangerous. Danielle Brooks had been 3 tables away, balancing a tray of untouched champagne, when the glass shattered. She didn't scream. She didn't freeze. She set the tray down on the nearest surface without looking where it landed, and moved toward the collapsed man with a calm that unsettled everyone who saw it. She'd seen this before, not this exact moment, but this body, this particular unraveling. The rigid fingers curling inward, the lips losing their color at the edges, the way his chest fought for air it couldn't quite catch. Her father had drilled these signs into her before she was old enough to drive, back when he still came home smelling like antiseptic and adrenaline, back before Seoul swallowed him whole and never gave him back. One of Jun-hyuk's men stepped into her path, a wall of black suit and bad intentions. "Stay away from him." Danielle didn't slow down. "If you don't let me near him in the next 30 seconds, he's going to die on this floor in front of you, and you'll spend the rest of your life explaining that to whoever comes looking for answers." Something in her voice made him step aside. She dropped to her knees beside Jun-hyuk and tilted his head, checking his airway with fingers that didn't shake, despite the 24 armed men now surrounding her in a loose, uncertain circle. She barked instructions without looking up. Someone needed to loosen his collar. Someone needed to find out what he'd swallowed in the last 10 minutes. Someone needed to stop standing there and start being useful. Nobody in that room had ever been spoken to that way. Not by a woman. Not by a stranger in a server's uniform who smelled like champagne and urgency. Across the table, Yoon Hee-rin hadn't moved an inch. Her expression gave away nothing. Not panic, not guilt, not relief. She watched the American woman work on her husband's body with the stillness of someone observing a storm through reinforced glass. And if anyone had been paying attention to her instead of him, they might have noticed her hands were trembling beneath the table, hidden in the folds of her dress. Danielle worked fast. She cleared his airway, angled his body, kept pressure steady against his chest when his breathing stuttered and threatened to stop altogether. Somewhere in the back of her mind, a voice that sounded exactly like her father's walked her through every step, the way it had 100 times since he died, since she'd started hearing him, in moments that demanded a steadiness she didn't always feel. Jun-hyuk's eyes fluttered open for less than 2 seconds, long enough to find her face, long enough for something to pass between them that neither of them could name yet. Then his eyes rolled back, and he went still, and for one unbearable moment, nobody in that dining room breathed at all. He was alive. Barely, but alive. The ambulance took 11 minutes to arrive, though it felt like 11 years to everyone standing in that room in silence, watching a stranger keep their boss tethered to the world, with nothing but her bare hands and a decade-old memory of her father's voice. Hee-rin rode in the car behind the ambulance, alone. She didn't ask to see him. She didn't cry. She sat with her hands folded in her lap and stared out the window at a city that suddenly felt like it was closing in around her. And somewhere beneath the ice she'd spent 8 years perfecting, something in her chest was cracking wide open. The hospital Jun Hyuk was taken to didn't exist on any public registry. 6 floors, no signage, staffed entirely by doctors who understood that certain patients required certain kinds of silence. By the time the toxicology results came back, the sun was already climbing over the Han River, and the diagnosis had confirmed exactly what Danielle suspected the moment she saw him hit the floor. Poison, deliberate, precisely measured. Someone in that room had wanted Kang Jun-hyuk dead, and they'd wanted it to look effortless. His men didn't need long to build a case. The security footage showed Hye-rin's hand resting near his wine glass minutes before dinner was served. Bank records revealed she'd withdrawn an amount of money large enough to disappear on, transferred through 3 accounts that led nowhere anyone could trace, and she'd chosen his seat that night, insisted on it, according to the restaurant staff, positioning him exactly where the poisoned glass would be waiting. Every piece pointed at her, every single one. When Jun-hyuk finally opened his eyes in a private recovery room, his throat raw, his body still fighting off whatever had been put inside it, his first word wasn't a question about his condition, or his enemies, or the empire that ran on his continued existence. It was her name. "Where's my wife?" His men exchanged glances. Half of them expected the order that usually followed a betrayal like this. A swift, final, unforgiving kind of justice that the organization had built its reputation on. Instead, Jun-hyuk repeated himself, quieter this time, and something in his voice made it clear the order wasn't coming. "Bring her to me." Hye-rin entered the room 20 minutes later, dressed exactly as she had been the night before, as though she hadn't slept, hadn't eaten, hadn't allowed herself a single moment of relief since watching her husband collapse in front of her. She stood at the foot of his bed with her spine straight and her face unreadable. "Did you poison me?" His voice was hoarse, stripped down to something almost gentle, which made the question land harder than a shout ever could have. She held his gaze without blinking. "No." "Then why?" he said, each word deliberate. "Did you sit there and watch me die?" Silence. She opened her mouth once, as if the truth had finally worked its way to the surface after 8 years of burial. And then she closed it again, swallowing whatever she'd almost let loose into the room. That silence told him everything he thought he needed to know. "Get out," he said. She left without another word, without tears, without a single glance back. And nobody in that hospital wing had any idea that the woman walking away from him carried the one piece of truth that could unravel everything. A truth she'd been protecting with her silence since the moment she'd switched his glass and prayed she'd guessed right. She hadn't. And somewhere across the city, the man who'd engineered all of it was already celebrating. 3 days passed before Jun-hyuk could stand without his legs threatening to give out beneath him, and every one of those 3 days, he asked the same question to anyone who came within earshot. Who was the woman who saved him? Nobody had answers that satisfied him. A waitress, temporary staff hired through an agency for the private event, gone from the restaurant system by the time anyone thought to look. No permanent address on file, no emergency contact. A woman who had walked into his world for exactly as long as it took to keep him breathing, then vanished before she could be thanked, questioned, or repaid. That absence gnawed at him more than the poison had. His men found her 4 days later, working a shift at a smaller restaurant near Itaewon, and when they told her Kang Jun-hyuk wanted to see her, Danielle didn't flinch the way most people did at the sound of his name. She untied her apron, folded it over the back of a chair, and told them she needed 10 minutes to finish her shift properly before she went anywhere with anyone. They waited. Nobody argued with her. Nobody quite knew how. When she finally stood across from him in a private room stripped of warmth, all steel and glass, and the particular silence of men who'd rather not be questioned, Jun-hyuk studied her the way he studied everyone who might be a threat, carefully, patiently, looking for the crack that would tell him what she really wanted. "Who taught you to do what you did that night?" he asked. "My father." Her voice didn't waver. "He was a paramedic. Emergency response. 20 years. He used to take me on ride-alongs when I was young enough that I should have been in bed instead, and he made sure I knew how to keep someone alive with nothing but my hands, long before I understood why that mattered." Where is he now? Something shifted behind her eyes, brief and controlled. Dead. Years ago. Jun Hyuk let the silence stretch, watching her the way he watched every piece on a board before he decided how to move it. There was something about the way she said dead. Not grieving exactly, but guarded, like the word was a door she kept locked most days, and had just been forced to crack open a few inches. What was his name? She told him. And Kang Jun Hyuk, a man who had built an empire on remembering every name that ever mattered and forgetting everyone that didn't, felt something cold settle low in his stomach, because that name wasn't unfamiliar to him at all. It belonged somewhere in the oldest ledgers of his family's history, buried under 2 decades of silence, in a place he hadn't let his mind wander in years. He didn't say anything to her about it. Not yet. But that night, alone in his study with a bottle he didn't touch, he pulled the organization's old financial archives out of storage, for the first time since his father died, and he started searching for a name he was suddenly certain he already knew he'd find. He found it by morning. Danielle's father hadn't been a criminal, hadn't been muscle, hadn't been anyone Jun Hyuk's world would typically produce. He'd been an accountant, brought in decades earlier by Jun Hyuk's own father to untangle a financial mess inside the organization. A mess that turned out to be something far more dangerous than bad bookkeeping. He'd uncovered corruption, money bleeding out of the family in directions it was never supposed to go, funneled by hands that were supposed to be loyal, and then, not long after he'd found it, he'd died. Officially, an accident. Unofficially, nobody in Jun Hyuk's family had ever quite believed that, though nobody had ever said so out loud either, because saying it out loud meant admitting someone close to them had been willing to kill to keep the truth buried. When Jun Hyuk brought Danielle back in and told her what he'd found, something in her composure finally slipped. I always knew, she said quietly. I never had proof, but I knew he didn't just fall down a flight of stairs on his own. I knew someone in your world took him from me, and I spent years hating a name I couldn't even put a face to. And yet you saved my life, Jun Hyuk said, watching her carefully now, searching for the resentment he expected to find and coming up empty. Knowing what you believed about my family. Danielle met his eyes without apology. I didn't save you because I love you. I didn't even know your name until they told me who you were. I saved you because I've watched one man I loved die on a floor exactly like that, and I made a promise to myself a long time ago that I would never stand still and let it happen again to anyone, no matter who they were. The answer unsettled him more than any threat ever had. Because every person in his orbit had a reason to want him alive. Money, protection, fear, ambition, the 1,000 quiet debts that came with proximity to power. Danielle Brooks had every reason to want him dead, and instead she'd knelt on marble in a cocktail dress and refused to let him die anyway. For the first time in longer than he could remember, Kang Jun Hyuk didn't know what to do with a person who wanted absolutely nothing from him. Hee-rin didn't go home that night. She went to an underground parking structure on the far side of the city, 3 levels below street noise, where a car with tinted windows waited exactly where it had waited every time before. She slid into the passenger seat and closed the door without a sound. The man beside her didn't look at her. He survived. I know. Does he know? Her hands were folded tight in her lap, knuckles pale under the dim glow of the dashboard. Not yet. The silence between them stretched long enough to feel dangerous. Anyone watching from a distance, and someone always seemed to be watching, in Jun Hyuk's world, would have assumed they were witnessing the aftermath of a conspiracy finally paying off. A wife and her accomplice, confirming a job well done. They would have been catastrophically wrong. Because 3 days earlier, Hye-rin had learned something that split her carefully constructed life down the center. A contact she'd spent years cultivating inside the organization's inner circle had come to her in a panic, whispering that someone intended to poison her husband at their anniversary dinner. The wine. The seat he always insisted on taking. Every detail, mapped out with a precision that told her whoever planned it knew Jun Hyuk's habits as intimately as she did. She hadn't gone to him. She couldn't. Going to him meant explaining how she knew, and explaining how she knew meant unraveling 8 years of a lie she'd built brick by brick to keep the people she loved alive. So she'd done the only thing she could do without exposing herself. She switched the glass. Standing near the table before dinner was served, She'd swapped his prepared wine with an untouched glass from the service cart, certain she was removing the threat entirely, certain she was saving him without him ever needing to know how close he'd come to dying. She hadn't accounted for one thing. The replacement glass had already been compromised too. A second, separate poison, planted by someone who wanted absolute certainty that this night would end exactly one way. Whoever was hunting her husband hadn't left anything to chance. They'd poisoned every possible glass on that table, every contingency covered, every escape route sealed before she ever thought to open one. She hadn't saved him. She'd handed him a different kind of death and prayed, for one unbearable moment, that she'd guessed correctly. When he collapsed, she'd frozen, not from guilt over poisoning him, but from the devastating realization that her intervention had failed, that she was now standing over a man she'd tried to protect, watching him die anyway, unable to say a single word without confessing to a plan that would look, to every person in that room, exactly like murder. "Don't touch him," she'd said. Not because she wanted him dead, because she needed 30 seconds to think, to figure out what poison had actually reached his system, to decide whether saying anything would save his life or simply speed up her own execution. By the time she'd found the words, Danielle Brooks was already on her knees beside him, doing the job Hai-Rin's silence had cost precious seconds of. Now, sitting in a parking structure 3 levels underground, Hai-Rin turned to the man beside her, the one contact who'd risked his own life feeding her information for years, the only person who knew the truth of what she'd spent nearly a decade building. "I need to know who else is involved," she said, "because whoever set this up knew things only someone close to him could know." The man exhaled slowly. "That's what worries me too. What the audience didn't yet understand, what Hai-Rin herself was only beginning to piece together, was the reason she'd married Kang Jun-hyuk in the first place, 8 years earlier, in a ceremony that had looked, to everyone watching, like the union of 2 powerful families. It hadn't been love, not at the start. Her own family had been threatened years before the wedding. Yeah, quietly, precisely, in the way threats worked inside organizations like his, not with violence, not at first, but with the promise of it, delivered by a man who understood exactly how much damage could be done without ever raising his voice. Marrying into the Kang family had been the price of her family's safety, negotiated in a single conversation she'd never told her husband about, arranged by the very man now circling him like a patient predator, Kang Min-jae. She'd spent 8 years playing the role of a cold, distant wife, because closeness was dangerous. Every time she let herself soften toward her husband, every time genuine affection threatened to surface in a stolen glance or an unguarded moment, she reminded herself that Min-jae was always watching, always calculating, always ready to use anyone she cared about as leverage against her family. Her coldness wasn't cruelty, it was armor, built to protect the one man she'd quietly, carefully, against every instinct of self-preservation, fallen in love with anyway. A truth she'd buried so deep that even she sometimes forgot it was there. She'd spent those same 8 years gathering evidence, financial records, whispered conversations, the occasional careless mistake Min-jae made when he assumed nobody in the family was paying close enough attention to notice. She was close, closer than she'd ever been, and now her husband thought she'd tried to kill him. Meanwhile, across the city, Danielle sat alone in her small apartment, scrolling through the restaurant's internal footage on a laptop she wasn't technically authorized to access anymore, chasing a detail that had been nagging at her since the night of the collapse. Something about the timeline didn't sit right. The kitchen staff's statements didn't line up with what she remembered seeing. And when she pulled the security logs from the server room, adjacent to the private dining hall, she found something that made her sit back slowly in her chair. A 7-minute gap. Someone had gone into that server room less than 20 minutes before dinner was served, and whatever they'd done in those 7 minutes had been erased from the record entirely. A clean, professional deletion, the kind that only someone with intimate access to the system could have pulled off. Danielle leaned closer to the screen, cross-referencing employee badge logs against the gap in the footage, and when the name populated on her screen, her stomach dropped. It wasn't kitchen staff, it wasn't restaurant security. It was a name she recognized from every conversation she'd had inside that organization over the past week. A name spoken with nothing but reverence and loyalty by every single person she'd encountered. Kang Min-jae. Danielle stared at the name on her screen for a long time before she moved again. Kang Min-jae. The brother who had rushed to the hospital the night of the collapse, who had stood in the hallway outside Jun-hyuk's recovery room fielding calls, coordinating security, playing the part of a devastated family member with a precision that, in hindsight, felt less like grief and more like performance. The man everyone in the organization spoke about with the kind of unquestioning loyalty usually reserved for founders, not younger brothers. She thought about deleting her browser history and walking away, pretending she'd never opened that server log, getting on a flight and putting the entire country behind her before anyone realized what she'd found. Instead, she took a photograph of the screen with her phone, backed the file up in 3 separate places, and started building a timeline. She should have been more careful about who noticed her doing it. 2 days later, evidence began appearing that Danielle couldn't account for. A security guard reported finding her fingerprints near a kitchen storage area she swore she'd never entered. Her old employment file, the one that should have shown a clean, unremarkable work history, mysteriously vanished from the staffing agency's database, replaced by a version riddled with inconsistencies that made her look transient, untraceable, exactly like someone who might slip in and out of a job long enough to poison a target and disappear. And worst of all, someone had leaked the connection between her father and Jun-hyuk's organization to the very men who'd spent the last week treating her like a hero. The story spread through the ranks within hours, twisted just enough at every retelling to sound less like tragedy and more like motive. Her father had uncovered corruption inside the family. Her father had died under suspicious circumstances, and now his daughter had conveniently appeared at the exact dinner where Jun-hyuk nearly died, armed with medical knowledge specific enough to make her look like either a savior or an executioner who'd simply misjudged her dosage. By the time Jun-hyuk heard the rumors, they'd already hardened into something that looked, on paper, disturbingly close to a confession. He summoned her that evening, not gently. Danielle walked into his study and knew immediately, from the set of his jaw and the distance in his eyes, that something had shifted since their last conversation. Gone was the man who'd searched his family's archives all night just to understand who her father was. In his place stood the version of Kang Jun-hyuk that had built an empire, cold, calculating, already 3 steps into deciding what to do with a threat. "Explain the fingerprints," he said. "I don't know anything about fingerprints. I've never been near that storage room. Explain your employment record." "I can't, because it's not the record I gave them when I was hired. Someone changed it." "Convenient," he said, "that everything convenient for you happens to disappear, and everything damning happens to appear." Danielle felt something in her chest go hot and tight. "You think I did this? After everything I did to keep you alive, you actually think I orchestrated all of it?" "I think," Jun-hyuk said, each word measured, deliberate, deployed like a blade, "that a woman with a decade of buried resentment toward my family showed up at my table the same night someone tried to kill me and happened to know exactly how to keep me breathing long enough to gain my trust. I saved your life. Maybe," he said, "you saved me so you could be the one to take it later, on your own terms, once you'd earned my trust and gotten close enough to finish what your father's death started." The words landed like a slap. Danielle stood there for a moment, absorbing the sheer, staggering unfairness of it. The fact that a man she'd knelt beside on a marble floor, pressing her own hands against his chest to keep him tethered to the world, could look at her now and see nothing but a threat, a schemer, a woman calculating an angle. "You're wrong," she said quietly. "And one day you're going to realize exactly how wrong, and by then it might be too late to say you're sorry." She turned and walked out of his study without waiting for a response, without looking back, her spine straight, even as something inside her cracked from the sheer weight of being accused of the one thing she'd spent her entire life trying to prevent. Watching someone she'd fought to save die anyway, only this time it was her own reputation bleeding out on the floor instead of his body. Jun-hyuk didn't stop her. He told himself it was strategy. Distance. The smart move, given everything stacked against her. But long after she'd gone, he stood alone in his study staring at the door she'd walked through, and some small, insistent part of him that he refused to acknowledge kept whispering that he'd just made the worst mistake of his life. He wasn't wrong to feel that way, because at that exact moment, in a penthouse across the city, Kang Min-jae was pouring himself a drink and smiling at his own reflection in the window, watching the lights of Seoul spread out beneath him like a kingdom he'd spent 20 years patiently waiting to inherit. Everything was proceeding exactly as planned. His brother, isolated and suspicious of the one person who'd actually saved him, Rin, cornered and unable to defend herself without exposing a secret that would destroy the fragile trust she'd spent nearly a decade rebuilding. Danielle, framed so thoroughly that even her rescue looked like the opening move of an assassination. All Min-jae had to do now was wait for his brother to make one final, fatal decision. And the empire that should have belonged to him from the beginning would finally, quietly, fall into his hands. He raised his glass to the city below. "Almost there," he murmured, and drank. Danielle didn't cry until she was alone in her apartment, and even then, it only lasted a few minutes before she forced herself to stop, wiping her face with the back of her hand, and staring at the half-packed bag on her bed, like it belonged to someone else's life. She'd flown across an ocean once before, years earlier, chasing the ghost of a father who died with too many unanswered questions attached to his name. She'd told herself then that she was done letting Seoul take anything else from her. And now here she was again, standing in the wreckage of a decision to help a man who'd repaid her by accusing her of murder, wondering if some part of her simply couldn't stop reaching for closure that kept slipping further out of reach. She thought about calling someone back home. There wasn't really anyone left to call. Her mother had passed 2 years after her father, and the friends who'd known her before Seoul had drifted the way friends do, when grief makes you difficult to be around for too long. She'd built a small, careful life for herself here instead, quiet and self-sufficient, exactly the kind of life that made it easy to disappear from a restaurant staffing system without anyone noticing for days. She zipped the bag halfway, then stopped, sitting down on the edge of the bed with her hands pressed against her eyes. Because as angry as she was, and she was furious, more furious than she'd let herself feel in years, some stubborn, exhausted part of her kept circling back to the moment Jun Hyuk's eyes had found hers on that dining room floor, right before he lost consciousness. There had been nothing calculating in that look. No suspicion, no strategy. Just a man clinging to consciousness long enough to see the face of the person keeping him alive. That wasn't the same man who'd accused her of orchestrating his own poisoning. Or maybe it was exactly the same man, just buried under 20 years of learning that everyone eventually wants something from him, and she was foolish for expecting to be the exception. She was still turning the thought over when the knock came at her door. Hye-rin appeared at his study door less than an hour after Danielle left it, and something about the way she stood there, steady, resolved, none of the practiced distance she usually wore like a second skin, made Jun Hyuk set down the glass he hadn't touched in 20 minutes. "You're looking for the wrong woman," she said. "Hye-rin, let me finish. I've spent 8 years letting you believe things about me that weren't true, because the alternative meant putting people I love in danger. And I'm done. I'm done watching you tear apart the one person who actually saved your life, while the person responsible drinks champagne in a penthouse and congratulates himself." Jun Hyuk went very still. "Explain." So she did. She told him about the warning she'd received 3 days before the anniversary dinner. Vague at first, then increasingly specific, until it named the exact glass, the exact seat, the exact moment the poison would be administered. She told him she'd switched his wine with an untouched glass from the service cart, certain she was saving him, only to watch him collapse anyway, and realize, in the worst possible way, that whoever had planned this had left no version of that table untouched. "I didn't poison you," she said. "I made a choice that turned out to be wrong, and then I froze. Because confessing meant admitting I'd known in advance, and admitting that meant explaining how I knew, and explaining that meant telling you a truth I've been protecting for almost a decade." "What truth?" Hye-rin's composure finally, fully broke. "I didn't marry you for love. Not at first. My family was threatened before the wedding. Quietly, the way threats work in your world. Delivered by someone who understood exactly what would happen if I refused. Marrying you was the price of keeping the people I love alive." Jun Hyuk felt the floor of his understanding shift beneath him. "Who threatened you?" She held his gaze, and for the first time in 8 years, didn't look away from the answer. "Your brother." The silence that followed lasted long enough for the weight of it to fully settle. I've spent 8 years building a case against him, she continued. Financial records, conversations, every mistake he's ever been careless enough to make in front of someone he assumed wasn't paying attention. I couldn't get close to you, Jun-hyuk. Every time I let myself soften, every time something real threatened to surface, I reminded myself he was watching, always watching, and if he ever suspected what I actually felt for you, he'd use it against both of us without hesitation. What you actually felt for me, Jun-hyuk repeated quietly. Hye-rin's jaw tightened, but she didn't retreat from it. I fell in love with my husband somewhere in the middle of pretending I hadn't. I just never found a way to tell you without putting you directly in his crosshairs. Jun-hyuk stood there, absorbing 8 years of distance, reframing itself in real time. Every cold glance, every clipped conversation, every carefully maintained wall between them. Not cruelty, but armor, built by a woman protecting him the only way she knew how. Min-jae erased 7 minutes of security footage the night of the dinner, he said finally. Danielle found it before anyone else did. That's why the evidence against her appeared so quickly afterward. He needed her discredited before she could show anyone what she'd found. Hye-rin's eyes widened. Then we need to move before he realizes she already has proof. For the first time since the collapse, husband and wife stood on the same side of a war. Neither of them had fully understood they were fighting, and something between them, buried under 8 years of necessary distance, finally began to thaw. I owe her an apology, Jun-hyuk said quietly. One I'm not sure she'll ever accept. Then you'd better make it count, Hye-rin said. Because from what I've heard about that woman, she doesn't tolerate being wrong about twice. Jun-hyuk found Danielle at a small apartment on the edge of the city, a bag already half-packed on her bed. A one-way flight pulled up on her laptop screen. She didn't invite him in. She stood in the doorway with her arms crossed, daring him to say something worth her time. I was wrong, he said, without preamble, without the armor he usually wore into every conversation. About the fingerprints, the employment records, all of it. My brother fabricated the evidence to isolate you before you could expose him. I already knew that, Danielle said flatly. I found the footage days ago. I know. That's exactly why he needed you discredited so quickly. Something in her expression cracked, just slightly, the anger giving way to something more exhausted underneath it. You accused me of trying to kill you. I know. You looked me in the eye and said I might have saved you just to be the one to finish the job. I know, he said again, quieter this time. And I don't expect you to forgive me for it. I came because you're the only person who has proof of what my brother did, and because if you leave the country tonight, he wins completely, and I refuse to let that happen. Not to you. Not after everything you already sacrificed to keep me alive. Danielle studied him for a long moment, weighing the apology against the accusation, the man in front of her, against the man who'd looked at her with such cold suspicion only hours earlier. If I help you, she finally said, it's not for you. It's for my father, and for whatever justice looks like after 20 years of nobody caring enough to ask questions. That's enough for me, Jun-hyuk said. She stepped aside and let him in. They spent the next 2 days building a case airtight enough that even Min-jae's oldest allies inside the organization wouldn't be able to explain it away. Danielle laid out everything she'd found on the security footage. The 7-minute gap, the badge logs, the precise timestamp that placed Min-jae inside the server room less than 20 minutes before dinner was served. Hye-rin contributed years of quietly gathered financial records. Transactions routed through shell accounts that all, eventually, traced back to the same hidden signature buried beneath layers of falsified paperwork. And Jun-hyuk, working through the night with a focus he hadn't summoned in years, cross-referenced every discrepancy against decades of organizational history his brother had spent just as long carefully sanitizing. What emerged wasn't just a poisoning attempt. It was a pattern, small accidents that had claimed the lives of men who'd once threatened to expose irregularities in the organization's finances. A convenient string of resignations among staff who'd asked too many questions about missing funds. A decades-old accountant who'd uncovered corruption and died within weeks of reporting it. Danielle's father, the first domino in a chain neither of them had fully understood until now. He's been doing this for 20 years, Hye-rin said quietly, staring at the spread of documents across the table just past midnight. Not in dramatic strokes, in small, patient ones, nudging people out of his way whenever they got close enough to see him clearly. And nobody noticed, Junhyuk said, because he made himself impossible to suspect. The charming brother, the loyal second. The man everyone trusted, precisely because trusting him never occurred to anyone as a mistake. Danielle sat back, rubbing her eyes, exhaustion finally catching up to the adrenaline that had carried her through the last week. My father figured it out. That's why he died, not because he stumbled onto something by accident, but because he was good at his job, and being good at his job in this organization apparently came with a death sentence attached. Junhyuk looked at her for a long moment. I'm sorry. For what my family did to yours, even if I didn't know the full shape of it until tonight. I don't need your apology, Danielle said, not unkindly. I need him to answer for it. That's different. He will, Junhyuk said, and something in his voice left no room for doubt. They agreed the confrontation needed to happen carefully, publicly enough that Min-jae couldn't simply disappear or eliminate them before anyone realized what was happening, but controlled enough that Junhyuk could draw the confession out of him rather than simply accusing him and risking an already cornered man doing something unpredictable. That meant Junhyuk would need to lie to his brother's face one final time. You're certain this will work? Hyrin asked, watching him fasten the small recording device into the lining of his jacket, hands steady despite everything they'd learned in the last 48 hours. He's spent his entire life being underestimated, Junhyuk said. The one thing he won't be able to resist is believing, even for a moment, that he finally won. I just need him to say enough to prove it. Danielle stood near the window, watching the city lights flicker below, thinking about a father she'd buried without ever knowing the real reason he was gone, about 20 years of grief that had just found, at last, somewhere to point itself. Be careful, she said quietly, without quite turning to look at him. Junhyuk paused at the door. Are you worried about me? I'm worried about unfinished business, she said. I didn't come this far to watch you get yourself killed before your brother answers for what he did. Something almost like a smile crossed his face, brief and unfamiliar. Noted. He left for his brother's office 20 minutes later, carrying a recording device, a carefully constructed lie, and the full weight of everything he now understood about the people he'd trusted his entire life. Kang Min-jae had built his entire strategy on one assumption, that his brother's grief and suspicion would keep him isolated, distracted, and too consumed with betrayal to look anywhere else for answers. He hadn't accounted for Hae-rin's silence breaking. He hadn't accounted for Danielle's patience with a security log. And he certainly hadn't accounted for his brother walking into his office 3 days later with an expression that gave away absolutely nothing. I know who poisoned me, Junhyuk said, settling into the chair across from his brother's desk with the unhurried calm of a man discussing the weather. Min-jae's pulse didn't so much as flicker on the surface. Who? My wife. Something in Min-jae's shoulders eased, so subtly that only someone looking for it would have caught the release of tension he'd been carrying for days. I'm sorry, Junhyuk. I know that must be difficult to accept. It is, Junhyuk agreed. But the evidence is overwhelming. The glass, the withdrawal, the timing of the seating arrangement. I should have seen it sooner. You were blinded by love, Min-jae said, and there was something underneath his sympathy now, something almost eager, like a man finally allowed to enjoy a meal he'd spent weeks anticipating. It happens to the best of us. What matters is that you see clearly now. I do, Junhyuk said, clearer than I have in years. What Min-jae didn't know, what nobody in that room besides Junhyuk himself was aware of, was the small recording device sewn into the lining of his jacket, capturing every word with the kind of clarity that would matter a great deal in the hours to come. There's just one detail I can't make sense of, Junhyuk continued, leaning forward slightly. The second poison. Min-jae's expression flickered, almost imperceptibly. Second poison? The toxicology report found 2 distinct compounds in my system that night. 2, not 1. Junhyuk's voice remained level, conversational, a blade wrapped in velvet. My wife only had access to 1 glass. So tell me, brother, how does a woman with access to a single glass manage to poison me twice? The silence that followed stretched long enough for something to shift permanently in the room. I don't know what you're implying, Min-jae said, but the ease in his voice had evaporated, replaced by something tighter, more careful. I'm not implying anything, Junhyuk said. I'm asking a question only the person who planned this could actually answer. And you just told me my wife did it, in detail, down to the withdrawal amount and the exact seat she chose. Details that were never released publicly. Details that only appeared in a private report I commissioned myself, 3 days ago, and shared with exactly one person. Min Jae's hand moved toward the drawer of his desk, slow and deliberate. But Jun Hyuk was already standing, already flanked by men who'd been listening from the hallway the entire time, already watching 2 decades of buried resentment surface across his brother's face in real time. You've been planning this for years, Jun Hyuk said quietly, haven't you? Min Jae's composure finally shattered into something raw and furious. Planning it? I've been waiting for it. Waiting for you to notice, even once, that everything you have, the loyalty, the respect, the empire our father built, should have been split evenly between us. And instead, you took all of it, while I stood beside you playing the loyal brother for 20 years, smiling every single day, while you never once considered that I might have wanted more than scraps. So you tried to kill me. I tried to fix a mistake our father made, the day he decided you were worth more than me. The room had gone utterly silent, every man present, understanding they were witnessing the collapse of a loyalty that had defined the organization for 2 decades, and Min Jae, sensing the walls closing in around him, moved faster than anyone anticipated. He grabbed Danielle. She'd been standing near the doorway, close enough to witness the confrontation, and Min Jae crossed the room in 3 strides and had his arm around her throat before anyone could react, a pistol pressed against her temple, with the practiced ease of a man who'd handled weapons his entire life. Everybody stay exactly where they are, he said, backing toward the far wall, dragging Danielle with him. Or she dies before any of you take a single step. Jun Hyuk froze. He had a clear line, a clean shot, men positioned at angles that could have ended this in seconds. And still, he hesitated, his eyes locked on Danielle's face, on the fear she refused to let fully show, on the woman who'd knelt beside him on a marble floor and refused to let him die, despite every reason she had to walk away. Min Jae watched the hesitation and laughed, low and bitter. Look at that. You finally found something you actually care about. No, Jun Hyuk said. A pause, heavy enough to still the room. I found someone worth protecting. Behind Min Jae, silent as a shadow, Hye-rin stepped through the side entrance he hadn't accounted for, a gun raised and steady in both hands, years of quiet preparation distilled into a single, unshaking moment. Move away from my husband, she said. Min Jae's head turned, just slightly, just enough to register the wife he'd spent 8 years threatening into submission standing behind him with a weapon he never taught her to use half as well as she clearly could. For one fractured second, nobody in the room moved. And then everything happened at once. Min Jae twisted to bring the pistol back toward Danielle the moment he registered Hye-rin's presence, some final, desperate instinct overriding 2 decades of careful discipline. But Jun Hyuk had already closed half the distance between them, and the men positioned along the far wall, men who had spent years pledging loyalty to the wrong brother without knowing it, moved as a single, unified wall of motion the second their true target became clear. Danielle didn't wait to be saved. She'd spent her entire life being the person who acted instead of froze, and in the half-second the room seemed to hang suspended, she drove her elbow back into Min Jae's ribs with everything she had, twisting free of his grip the way her father had drilled into her decades earlier during afternoons she'd never expected to need for anything beyond earning his approval. The gun clattered against the floor. Jun Hyuk reached Min Jae a heartbeat later, and the fight that followed was brief, brutal in its inevitability. 2 brothers who had spent 20 years standing side by side, finally facing each other as exactly what they'd become. One still holding on to the family he'd built, the other consumed by decades of resentment that had curdled into something unrecognizable. It ended with Min Jae on the floor, disarmed, restrained by the same men who had once called him their second in command. The silence that followed felt heavier than the chaos that preceded it. Danielle pressed her back against the wall, breathing hard, watching Jun Hyuk stand over his brother with an expression she hadn't seen on him before. Not rage, not triumph, but something closer to grief, the particular kind reserved for losing someone who was never actually who you believed them to be. 20 years, Jun Hyuk said quietly, staring down at him. I trusted you with everything. My father's legacy, my wife's safety, My own life, more times than I can count. And the entire time, you were waiting for a moment exactly like this one. Min Jae's composure had fully abandoned him now, replaced by something raw and furious and, underneath it, unmistakably wounded. I waited, because waiting was the only thing I was ever allowed to do. You think I wanted to spend 2 decades smiling at galas, standing 3 steps behind you at every meeting that mattered, watching every decision get made without me, because our father decided the day I was born that you'd always come first. That's not true. It's the only truth I've ever known. Min Jae's voice cracked, just slightly, before hardening again. I didn't want to kill you because I hated you, Junhyuk. I wanted to kill you because it was the only way I'd ever stop being invisible. The words hung in the room, ugly and honest, in a way that made even the hardened men along the walls shift uncomfortably. Junhyuk crouched slightly, bringing himself level with his brother for the first time since the confrontation began. You were never invisible to me. You were the person I trusted most in this world. That's what makes this so much worse than anything you could have said to justify it. Min Jae didn't answer. There was nothing left to say that would change what came next. Hyrene lowered her weapon slowly, her hands trembling now that the adrenaline had nowhere left to go, and Junhyuk gave the order that ended 2 decades of a lie disguised as brotherhood. Min Jae was led out of the office in silence, stripped of the title, the loyalty, and the family that had shielded him from consequence for far too long. Nobody spoke for a long moment after the door closed behind him. Then Danielle exhaled, sliding down the wall until she was sitting on the floor, adrenaline finally releasing its grip on her hands, which had started shaking now that there was nothing left to fight. Junhyuk crossed the room and crouched in front of her. "You're all right? Ask me again in about an hour," she said, managing a thin, exhausted smile. "Right now, I mostly just want to sit here until my hands stop doing this." He sat down on the floor beside her without a word, and for a long moment, neither of them said anything at all. 2 people who'd survived something neither of them fully understood how to name yet, sitting in the wreckage of a betrayal that had taken 20 years to detonate. "Thank you," he said eventually, "for not freezing. For not waiting for someone else to save you. I don't really know how to do that," Danielle admitted. "Freeze, I mean. My father made sure of it a long time ago. I'm starting to understand exactly how much I owe him," Junhyuk said quietly, "and exactly how little I ever knew about the man who shaped the woman who ended up saving my life twice in the same month." Across the room, Hyrene watched the 2 of them with an expression that held no jealousy, no suspicion, only something quiet and grateful. The look of a woman who finally understood that the family she'd fought so hard to protect might actually come out of this hole. Danielle looked over at Hyrene, still standing near the doorway with the weapon now lowered at her side, and something unspoken passed between the 2 women. Not quite friendship yet, but the beginning of something that understood exactly what the other had survived to get to this room. 2 women who'd spent this entire ordeal being underestimated by the same family, now standing on the same side of whatever came next. It was a quiet, unspoken alliance neither of them had expected, but both of them, in this exact moment, were grateful to have found. For the first time in longer than any of them could remember, the room felt, impossibly, like it might hold something close to peace. It wouldn't last, not with what was still coming. But for one evening, sitting on the floor of an office that had nearly become a crime scene twice in 1 month, none of them were thinking about what came next. They were simply, quietly, still alive. In the weeks that followed, the organization restructured itself around the truth. Min Jae's decades of quiet manipulation were unearthed piece by piece. The corrupted accounts, the falsified records, the small betrayals stacked one on top of another, until they formed a foundation Junhyuk had somehow never questioned. His brother's fall was swift and absolute, and left in its wake a silence that took the entire family months to fully understand how to fill. Hyrene and Junhyuk began, slowly, to build something neither of them had been permitted 8 years earlier. A marriage rooted in honesty instead of survival, in choice instead of obligation. It wasn't easy. 8 years of distance didn't dissolve overnight. But for the first time since their wedding day, both of them were finally working toward the same thing, instead of quietly protecting each other from opposite directions. Danielle prepared to leave Seoul. She didn't want Junhyuk's money. She'd been offered more of it than she'd make in a decade of restaurant work, and she'd turned it down without hesitation. She didn't want his protection, didn't want a place inside an organization that had cost her father his life 2 decades earlier, didn't want to become another quiet casualty of a world built on power and blood debts. She wanted to go home, to close a chapter that had opened the moment her father died and never fully closed since. Jun-hyuk found her at the airport the morning she was scheduled to leave, and instead of asking her to stay, a request he suspected, correctly, she would refuse, he handed her a small, worn photograph. "I found this in my father's private files," he said. "I thought you should have it before you go." Danielle turned it over in her hands. A younger version of her father stood beside a younger version of Jun-hyuk's father, both men smiling in a way she'd never seen in any photograph she owned, captured in a moment that predated everything that came after. On the back, in handwriting she recognized instantly, her father had written a single line, "If my daughter ever finds out the truth, protect her." Danielle's breath caught. "You knew my father. He saved my life once," Jun-hyuk said quietly. "Long before either of us were born into the versions of ourselves we became. I only just found the file 3 days ago, buried somewhere my own father clearly never wanted anyone to find. I don't know the full story yet, but I know he mattered to my family long before you ever walked into that dining room." Danielle stared at the photograph, at the easy warmth between 2 men from 2 entirely different worlds, and felt something in her chest shift. The certainty that had carried her through the last 2 weeks, the belief that she'd stumbled into Jun-hyuk's life by nothing but coincidence, and a paramedic's instinct, giving way to something far stranger and far heavier. Because the night she'd saved his life hadn't been the first time their families' paths had crossed. Her father had saved his father, years before either of them existed to witness it. And now, decades later, in a dining room neither of them had chosen, the daughter had saved the son, not by accident, not by coincidence, but as though something had been quietly, patiently waiting 2 decades to come full circle. "There's more," Jun-hyuk said, and something in his voice made Danielle look up sharply. "My father's file mentions a second name, someone your father worked with, before he ever came to Seoul. Someone who's been asking about you for the past 3 weeks, according to a contact I only just heard from this morning. Someone who claims to know exactly why your father really died, and it isn't the story either of us has been told." Danielle's grip tightened on the photograph. "Who?" Jun-hyuk held her gaze, and for the first time since she'd met him, something that looked almost like fear crossed his face. "I don't know yet, but whoever it is, they're already on their way to Seoul. And if what my contact says is true, this isn't over. It never was." Somewhere behind them, an airport announcement echoed, calling passengers toward a flight Danielle suddenly wasn't certain she was going to board. If this story pulled you in the way I think it did, let me know in the comments. Comment part 2 if you want to find out who's coming for Danielle next, and what really happened to her father 20 years ago. Hit subscribe if you haven't already, drop a like before you go, and tell me where in the world you watched this one from. Part 2 is coming, and trust me, it gets darker from here.